The morning sun cast long shadows across the city streets as Maya Johnson gripped the steering wheel of her worn sedan, her knuckles white with tension. The drive to work had become a daily exercise in hypervigilance, each intersection a potential flashpoint. Maya's eyes darted between the rearview mirror and the road ahead, her mind racing with the day's lesson plans and the weight of her responsibilities. And if you love your family and want to hear more incredible stories like this one, subscribe to our channel. As a teacher in this divided community, Maya knew her role extended far beyond the classroom walls. Her students came from all walks of life, each carrying their own burdens and hopes. She had witnessed firsthand the effects of systemic inequality on young minds, and it fueled her determination to make a difference. Traffic crawled along the main avenue, and Maya's gaze fell on a mural depicting scenes of unity and progress. The irony wasn't lost on her. The painted facade of harmony stood in stark contrast to the tension that crackled just beneath the surface of daily life. A police cruiser appeared in her rearview mirror, its presence causing an involuntary tightening in her chest. Maya checked her speed, ensured her seatbelt was secure, and took a deep breath. She had done nothing wrong, she reminded herself, yet the fear remained. Officer Hank Thompson sat behind the wheel of his patrol car, his eyes narrowed as he scanned the morning traffic. His shift had barely begun, but a familiar restlessness already gnawed at him. He spotted Maya's car, and something about it, or rather, someone about it, caught his attention. Without hesitation, Hank flipped on his lights and siren. Maya's heart sank as she realized she was being pulled over. She guided her car to the curb, hands trembling slightly as she put it in park. In her mind, she ran through the checklist her parents had drilled into her since childhood. License and registration ready, hands visible, calm and respectful responses. Hank approached the driver's side window, his face an impassive mask. "License and registration," he barked, the words more command than request. Maya complied, her movements deliberate and measured. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Hank asked, his tone carrying an edge of accusation. Maya swallowed hard. "No, officer. I don't believe I was speeding or violating any traffic laws." Hank's eyes narrowed. "Reckless driving," he stated flatly. "You were swerving in your lane." Maya's confusion and fear mingled into a knot in her stomach. She knew she had been driving carefully, hyper-aware of her surroundings. "I'm sorry, officer, but I don't think—" "Step out of the vehicle," Hank interrupted, his hand moving to rest on his holster. Time seemed to slow as Maya realized the situation was escalating beyond her control. She opened her mouth to protest, to assert her rights, but the words died in her throat as Hank yanked open her car door. In a blur of motion, Maya found herself being roughly pulled from her seat. The world tilted as Hank's grip on her arm tightened painfully. She cried out, her voice rising in panic and disbelief. "Help! Somebody help me!" Maya screamed, her feet scrabbling for purchase on the pavement as Hank manhandled her towards his cruiser. Passers-by began to slow, some pulling out their phones to record the unfolding scene. Just blocks away, in the heart of the city, Maya's husband, Governor David Johnson, stood before a podium. Unaware of the ordeal his wife was enduring, he cleared his throat, preparing to deliver a speech on equality and justice that now seemed like a cruel irony. As Maya's cries echoed through the streets, a seed of change was planted, one that would soon grow to shake the very foundations of their community. Sarah Madison adjusted the focus on her camera, her trained eye capturing the morning light as it played across the faces of local residents going about their day. As a documentary filmmaker, she had chosen this neighborhood as the subject of her latest project, aiming to shed light on the complexities of life in a community grappling with deep-seated divisions. The familiar sounds of the city, car horns, distant sirens, the chatter of pedestrians, formed a backdrop to her work. Sarah had spent weeks embedding herself in the community, gaining trust and collecting stories. But nothing had prepared her for what she was about to witness. A commotion down the street caught her attention. Sarah swiveled her camera, zooming in on a police cruiser parked haphazardly by the curb. Her breath caught as she saw Officer Hank Thompson forcibly removing a woman from her car. Without hesitation, Sarah began recording, her instincts as a documentarian kicking in even as her heart raced with the shock of what she was seeing. Through her lens, Sarah captured every detail of the unfolding brutality, the fear in Maya's eyes, the aggression in Hank's posture, the growing crowd of horrified onlookers, all of it preserved in stark, undeniable clarity. Sarah's hands trembled slightly, but her grip on the camera remained steady, knowing that this footage could be crucial evidence. As Maya's cries for help pierced the air, Sarah felt a surge of anger and helplessness. She wanted to intervene, to stop the injustice playing out before her. But she knew that continuing to film was the most powerful action she could take in that moment. Her camera became a weapon of truth, cutting through the lies and cover-ups that had allowed such abuses to persist. Meanwhile, just a few blocks away, Governor David Johnson stood at a podium, unaware of the crisis unfolding involving his wife. The irony of the situation was not lost on those who would later piece together the events of that morning. David, a man of considerable power and influence, was about to speak on the very issues that were manifesting in real time on the streets of his city. David cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the crowd gathered before him. "Today," he began, his voice carrying the weight of authority and conviction, "we gather to address the challenges that face our community. The road to true equality and justice is long, but it is a journey we must undertake together." As David spoke of unity and progress, his words stood in stark contrast to the reality of what was happening to Maya. The disconnect between the lofty ideals being espoused from the podium and the brutal treatment of a citizen at the hands of law enforcement highlighted the deep-rooted issues plaguing the city. Unbeknownst to David, his phone buzzed in his pocket, an urgent message from Maya that would soon shatter the carefully constructed narrative of his speech. The governor continued, oblivious to the personal crisis that was about to intersect with his public duties. "We must confront the biases that divide us," David declared, his words ringing with unintended irony. "Every citizen, regardless of their background, deserves to feel safe and respected in our community." As David's speech reached its crescendo, the tension on the streets where Maya was being detained continued to escalate. Sarah, still filming, watched as the situation spiraled further out of control. She knew that the footage she was capturing would be pivotal in the fight for justice, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was witnessing a turning point for the entire community. The juxtaposition of David's impassioned speech about equality and the brutal reality of Maya's experience created a powerful narrative tension. It was a moment that would soon force the entire city to confront the gap between its professed values and the lived experiences of its citizens. As the morning unfolded, the lives of Maya, David, Hank, and Sarah became irrevocably intertwined, setting in motion a chain of events that would challenge the status quo and demand accountability from those in power. The story of that day would become a catalyst for change, igniting a movement that would reverberate far beyond the city limits. David's speech was reaching its conclusion when a member of his staff hurriedly approached the stage, a look of urgency etched across their face. The aide whispered something in David's ear, and the color drained from the governor's face. Without a word of explanation to the confused audience, David abruptly ended his address and rushed off the stage, leaving a wave of murmurs in his wake. His heart pounding, David sprinted through the streets, his security details struggling to keep pace. The polished facade of the political figure gave way to a man consumed by fear for his wife's safety. As he ran, the irony of his interrupted speech on equality and justice was not lost on him. The very issues he had been pontificating about were now brutally personified in Maya's ordeal. Sarah, still at the scene of Maya's detention, spotted David's approaching figure. She quickly made her way towards him, camera in hand, knowing that the footage she had captured could be crucial. "Governor Johnson," she called out, her voice cutting through the chaos. David skidded to a halt, his eyes wild with concern. Sarah introduced herself rapidly, explaining that she had witnessed and recorded the entire incident. Without hesitation, she played back the footage on her camera's display. The images that flashed before David's eyes sent a surge of anger and disbelief through him. He watched as Officer Hank Thompson manhandled Maya, saw the fear in his wife's eyes, heard her cries for help. The rawness of the footage stripped away any pretense of political calculation. In that moment, David was not the governor, but a husband witnessing the assault of his beloved wife. With renewed determination, David pushed through the growing crowd, Sarah close behind him. As they approached, the scene came into full view. Maya was pressed against the police cruiser, her wrists bound behind her back. Officer Thompson stood nearby, his stance defensive as he faced the increasingly agitated onlookers. "What is the meaning of this?" David's voice boomed, cutting through the tension. His presence seemed to electrify the air, and all eyes turned to him. Hank's expression flickered with recognition and a hint of uncertainty. "Governor Johnson," he began, his tone a mixture of surprise and forced authority. "This is a police matter. I'm going to have to ask you to step back." David's eyes narrowed, his voice low and dangerous. "That police matter is my wife, Officer Thompson, and I demand her immediate release." The crowd, recognizing the governor, began to press closer. Phones were raised, recording the confrontation. The personal had become political in the most dramatic way possible. Maya, seeing her husband, called out to him, "David, he said I was driving recklessly, but I wasn't doing anything wrong." David's jaw clenched as he turned back to Hank. "Is this true, officer? On what grounds are you detaining my wife?" Hank's composure began to crack under the intense scrutiny. "She was swerving in her lane, posing a danger to other drivers," he insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "That's a lie," Maya protested. "I was driving perfectly safely." Sarah stepped forward, her camera raised. "I have footage of the entire incident, Governor. From what I witnessed, your wife did nothing to warrant this treatment." The implications of Sarah's statement hung in the air. David's eyes met Hank's, and a silent battle of wills ensued. The officer's hand twitched near his holster, a reflexive action that did not go unnoticed. "I suggest you think very carefully about your next move, Officer Thompson," David said, his voice carrying the full weight of his office. "Release my wife, now." The tension reached a breaking point. Hank, realizing the gravity of the situation, reluctantly moved to unlock Maya's handcuffs. As soon as she was free, Maya rushed into David's arms, her body shaking with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. The crowd erupted in a mixture of cheers and angry shouts. Some called for Hank's immediate arrest, while others demanded broader action against police brutality. David held Maya close, his mind racing with the implications of what had just transpired. This was no longer just a personal affront. It was a pivotal moment that would define his governorship and the future of their community. As the couple stood surrounded by the swelling crowd, David knew that the speech he had given earlier was now rendered meaningless. Words were no longer enough. Action was required, and the eyes of the entire city, perhaps the entire nation, would be watching to see how he would respond to this challenge. The incident had laid bare the systemic issues plaguing their society. The question now was, how would they move forward from here? The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same again. The crowd's energy intensified, a palpable mix of anger and anticipation filling the air. Chants for justice began to ripple through the gathered masses, growing louder with each passing moment. No more brutality. Equal justice now. The voices merged into a thunderous chorus, demanding immediate action. Hank Thompson, now stripped of his earlier bravado, stood awkwardly to the side. His eyes darted nervously between David, Maya, and the seething crowd. The reality of his situation was beginning to sink in. This was no routine arrest that could be swept under the rug. He was face to face with the governor, surrounded by witnesses, and caught on camera. His mind raced, searching for a way to justify his actions. "Governor Johnson," Hank began, his voice strained as he attempted to maintain a semblance of authority. "I was simply following protocol. Your wife's driving." "Save it, Officer Thompson," David cut him off, his voice sharp with barely contained fury. "We both know that's not true. And thanks to this footage," he gestured to Sarah's camera, "the whole world will know it too." Maya, still trembling from the ordeal, stepped forward. The physical and emotional toll of the incident was evident in her posture, in the way she held herself, as if she might shatter at any moment. But there was a fire in her eyes, a determination that burned through the trauma. "This isn't just about me," Maya spoke, her voice gaining strength with each word. "How many others have suffered this kind of treatment in silence? How many lives have been ruined because of unchecked prejudice and abuse of power?" Her words struck a chord with the crowd. Murmurs of agreement swelled into shouts of support. Maya's personal ordeal was quickly becoming a rallying cry for a much larger cause. David, sensing the pivotal nature of the moment, knew he had to act. This was no longer just a crisis to be managed. It was an opportunity to effect real change. He turned to address the crowd, his political instincts kicking in even as he grappled with his personal anguish. "What happened here today is a disgrace," David began, his voice carrying over the din of the crowd. "It's a stark reminder of the work we still have to do to create a truly just society. I promise you, this incident will not be ignored or forgotten. There will be a full investigation, and those responsible will be held accountable." As David spoke, Sarah continued to film, capturing every word, every reaction. She knew that this footage would be crucial in the days to come, a testament to the raw emotions and promises made in the heat of the moment. Hank, realizing the gravity of his situation, made one last attempt to assert control. "Governor, I must insist that we handle this through proper channels. This is not the place." "Officer Thompson," David interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You've done enough. I suggest you return to your precinct and prepare for what's coming. Because I assure you, there will be consequences." The crowd cheered at David's words, but Maya placed a gentle hand on her husband's arm. Despite her ordeal, she recognized the need for measured action. "David," she said softly, "we need to do this right. For everyone who's ever been in my position but didn't have a governor for a husband." David nodded, understanding the wisdom in his wife's words. He turned back to the crowd, his voice taking on a more measured tone. "I ask for your patience and your trust. Change won't happen overnight, but it will happen. Today marks the beginning of a new chapter in our community's history." As the crowd began to disperse, their energy transforming from anger to a sense of cautious hope, David and Maya found themselves at the center of a media storm. Reporters who had been covering the governor's earlier speech now clamored for statements about the incident. Sarah approached the couple, her camera still rolling. "Governor, Mrs. Johnson, would you be willing to share your thoughts on what just happened? The people need to hear your story." Maya and David exchanged a look, a silent communication born of years of partnership. They knew that their response in this moment would set the tone for everything that followed. With a deep breath, they turned to face Sarah's camera, ready to share their experience with the world. As they began to speak, The weight of the moment settled over the scene. This was more than just a personal. As they began to speak, the weight of the moment settled over the scene. This was more than just a personal ordeal or a political crisis. It was the spark that could ignite real change. Maya's voice, though still shaky, carried a strength that resonated with everyone present. "What happened to me today is not unique," Maya began, her eyes meeting the camera lens unflinchingly. "It's a reality that many in our community face every day. But today, we have an opportunity to say, enough is enough. We can't allow fear and prejudice to dictate how we treat one another." David stood by her side, his arm protectively around her waist. "My wife is right," he added, his political persona giving way to raw emotion. "As your governor, I've spoken about equality and justice, but today I've seen firsthand how far we still have to go. I promise you, this isn't just talk anymore. We will take action." As the impromptu interview continued, the crowd that had begun to disperse slowly regathered, drawn by the powerful words of Maya and David. Sarah's camera captured it all. The determination in Maya's eyes, the mix of anger and resolve on David's face, and the hope dawning on the faces of those watching. Meanwhile, Officer Hank Thompson had retreated to his squad car, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. He sat behind the wheel, his radio crackling with concerned voices from dispatch, asking for an update. Hank's mind raced, torn between the instinct to defend his actions and the growing realization of the consequences he faced. As the day wore on, the incident quickly became national news. Social media exploded with the video of Maya's arrest and the subsequent confrontation. Hashtags demanding justice and police reform trended across platforms. The city found itself at the center of a larger conversation about systemic racism and abuse of power. Back at the governor's mansion, Maya and David faced the daunting task of addressing the public while also processing their personal trauma. Maya, still shaken but determined, insisted on being part of every discussion about next steps. "We can't let this moment pass," she urged David as they prepared for a press conference. "We have a platform now, a chance to make real change. We owe it to everyone who's ever been silenced to speak up." David nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility more acutely than ever before. "You're right," he agreed, "but we need to be strategic. This isn't just about punishing one officer, it's about changing the entire system." As they worked late into the night, drafting statements and policy proposals, the city outside hummed with tension and anticipation. Protest organizers mobilized, planning peaceful demonstrations to keep the pressure on for reform. Community leaders reached out to both Maya and David, offering support and demanding action. The following days would be crucial. The eyes of the nation were upon them, waiting to see how this story would unfold. Would this be the catalyst for lasting change? Or would it fade into the background, like so many incidents before? For Maya and David, the path forward was clear, though fraught with challenges. They had been thrust into the center of a movement, their personal pain becoming a rallying cry for justice. As they faced the cameras and the crowds, they knew that their actions in the coming days and weeks would shape not just their own lives, but the future of their community and potentially the nation. The stage was set for a battle against ingrained prejudices and systemic failures. It was a fight that would require courage, perseverance, and the unwavering support of a community ready for change. As the sun set on that tumultuous day, the city held its breath, poised on the brink of transformation. In the days following the incident, Maya's home became a hub of activity. Friends, fellow educators, and community activists gathered to offer support and strategize. The living room, once a quiet space for grading papers, now buzzed with passionate discussions and planning sessions. Among those present was Jamal, a longtime friend of Maya's and a respected community organizer. His experience in mobilizing peaceful protests was invaluable as they planned their next moves. "We need to keep the momentum going," Jamal insisted, his voice carrying the weight of years spent fighting for change. "This isn't just about one incident. It's about breaking the cycle of discrimination that's plagued our community for generations." Maya nodded, her resolve strengthened by the support surrounding her. "You're right, Jamal. We need to make sure this doesn't fade from public consciousness. What happened to me is just the tip of the iceberg." As they brainstormed ideas for peaceful demonstrations and awareness campaigns, Maya couldn't help but reflect on the students she taught. How many of them had faced similar situations? How many had family members who had suffered in silence? The thought fueled her determination to turn her traumatic experience into a catalyst for change. Across town, Officer Hank Thompson sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by empty beer cans, his uniform jacket thrown haphazardly over a chair. The past few days had been a whirlwind of internal investigations, media scrutiny, and mounting public pressure. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages from fellow officers, some offering support, others distancing themselves from the controversy. Hank's mind wandered to his childhood, to the beliefs instilled in him by his father, a veteran of the force. He had always seen the world in black and white, good guys versus bad guys. But now, faced with the consequences of his actions, doubt began to creep in. Was he really protecting and serving, or was he perpetuating a cycle of fear and mistrust? A knock at the door startled him from his reverie. It was Captain Rodriguez, his direct superior. The captain's face was grim as he entered, his posture tense. "Thompson, we need to talk," he began, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The brass is breathing down my neck. They want this situation contained, and fast." Hank straightened up, a mix of hope and apprehension coursing through him. "What do they want me to do, sir?" Rodriguez sighed heavily. "They want you to stick to your story. Say you had probable cause, that Johnson was resisting arrest. We'll back you up, but you need to hold the line. This could blow over if we play it right." As the captain spoke, Hank felt a knot forming in his stomach. Part of him wanted to grasp at this lifeline, to believe that he could weather this storm and return to his normal life. But another part, a part he had long ignored, whispered that this was his chance to break the cycle, to acknowledge his mistakes and work towards real change. Meanwhile, at the governor's mansion, David paced in his study, torn between his roles as a husband, a leader, and a politician. His advisors had been in and out all day, offering strategies to navigate the political minefield the incident had created. Some urged caution, warning of the potential backlash from police unions and conservative voters. Others pushed for bold action, seeing an opportunity to cement David's legacy as a reformer. As he mulled over his options, David's phone buzzed with a message from Maya. It was a photo of her with Jamal and the others, planning their peaceful protests. The determination in their faces struck a chord in David's heart. He realized that this wasn't just a political crisis to be managed. It was a moral imperative that demanded decisive action. With newfound clarity, David called his chief of staff. "Get me a meeting with the police commissioner and the attorney general," he ordered. "It's time we addressed the root of this problem." As night fell over the city, the various players in this unfolding drama found themselves at a crossroads. Maya and her supporters were energized, ready to take their message to the streets. Hank grappled with his conscience, weighing the easy path of denial against the difficult road of accountability, and David steeled himself for the battles ahead, knowing that the choices he made now would define not just his political career, but the future of the community he had sworn to serve. The city held its breath, sensing that change was coming. Whether it would be the change they hoped for remained to be seen. But one thing was certain: the events set in motion by that fateful traffic stop had created a momentum that could no longer be ignored or contained. The stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge the very foundations of power and justice in their society. As the sun rose over the city, casting long shadows across the streets, Maya Johnson found herself in an unfamiliar position, in front of the cameras rather than behind her teacher's desk. The local news station had requested an interview, eager to hear from the woman at the center of the growing controversy. Maya sat under the bright studio lights, her posture straight, her eyes clear and determined. The makeup artist had carefully concealed the lingering bruises from her encounter with Officer Thompson, but nothing could hide the fire that burned within her. "Mrs. Johnson," the interviewer began, leaning forward with practiced empathy, "can you tell us about your experience that day?" Maya took a deep breath, steadying herself. "What happened to me is not unique," she began, her voice strong and unwavering. "It's a reality that many in our community face every day. But I'm fortunate. I have a platform to speak out, to demand change. Many others don't have that luxury." As Maya spoke, her words resonated far beyond the confines of the studio. Across the city, people paused in their morning routines, turning up the volume on their TVs and radios. Her story, told with raw honesty and quiet dignity, cut through the noise of political spin and media speculation. In a small apartment across town, Sarah sat glued to her computer screen, watching Maya's interview while simultaneously editing her documentary footage. The filmmaker had been working tirelessly, knowing that her work could play a crucial role in shaping the narrative around this incident. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from a contact at a major news network. They wanted to license her footage of the arrest. Her finger hovered over the reply button as she weighed her options. The exposure could be huge, but she was wary of losing control over how her work would be used. Meanwhile, at the police precinct, Officer Hank Thompson sat in a small conference room, surrounded by union representatives and department lawyers. The atmosphere was tense as they prepared him for his upcoming disciplinary hearing. "Remember, stick to the facts as you perceive them," one of the lawyers instructed, his tone clipped and businesslike. "You believed you saw erratic driving. You followed procedure as you understood it." Hank nodded mechanically, but his mind was elsewhere. The certainty he had felt in the moment of Maya's arrest had eroded, replaced by a gnawing doubt. The image of Maya's fear, of the governor's anger, of the crowd's outrage, it all swirled in his mind, challenging everything he thought he knew about his role as an officer. As the day wore on, the city became a hive of activity. Community organizers, galvanized by Maya's words, took to the streets with signs and bullhorns. They marched peacefully, their numbers swelling as bystanders joined in, drawn by the energy and the promise of change. David, watching the protests unfold from his office window, felt the weight of expectation on his shoulders. He had spent the morning in tense meetings with his advisors, the police commissioner, and representatives from various community groups. The pressure to act was immense, coming from all sides. "We need to strike a balance," his chief of staff urged. "Show that we're taking this seriously without alienating law enforcement entirely." David shook his head, his patience wearing thin. "This isn't about political calculations anymore," he said firmly. "It's about doing what's right. We have a chance to make real, lasting change. I won't squander it." As evening approached, Maya found herself back home, exhausted but exhilarated. The house was once again filled with supporters, but this time, there was a new energy in the air. People clustered around laptops and phones, sharing social media updates and coordinating their efforts. Jamal approached Maya, a grin spreading across his face. "You were amazing today," he said, giving her a gentle hug. "People are listening. They're ready to act." Maya smiled, feeling a mixture of hope and trepidation. "This is just the beginning," she replied. "We have a long fight ahead of us." As night fell, the city hummed with anticipation. The events of the past few days had set in motion a chain reaction, challenging long-held power structures and demanding accountability. From the governor's mansion to the police precinct, from community centers to suburban living rooms, people grappled with difficult questions and uncomfortable truths. The story of Maya Johnson, once a simple teacher going about her day, had become a rallying cry for a movement. But as Maya herself knew all too well, movements were fragile things. The true test would come in the days and weeks ahead. As the initial shock and outrage gave way to the hard work of systemic change, as she prepared for bed, Maya paused to look out her window at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Officer Thompson was grappling with his own demons. David was strategizing his next move. Sarah was piecing together her documentary, and countless others were deciding where they stood in this pivotal moment. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the very foundations of their society. The question that hung in the air, unspoken but felt by all, was simple yet profound. Would this be the moment that finally brought about real, lasting change? The City Hall auditorium buzzed with tension as people filed in for the public hearing. David had called for this session to address the incident head-on, bringing together key figures from all sides of the issue. The room was a microcosm of the city itself. Community activists sat shoulder to shoulder with police officers, while concerned citizens filled every available space. At the front of the room, a panel had been assembled. David sat at the center, flanked by the police commissioner, the city attorney, and representatives from various community organizations. Maya was given a seat of honor, her presence a powerful reminder of why they were all there. As the hearing began, David leaned forward to address the crowded room. "We're here today to confront a difficult truth," he began, his voice carrying the weight of his office. "What happened to Maya Johnson is not an isolated incident. It's a symptom of deeper issues that have plagued our community for far too long. Today, we start the process of healing and reform." The first witnesses were called forward, citizens who had experienced similar encounters with law enforcement. Their stories, told with raw emotion and unflinching honesty, painted a picture of a community living in fear of those sworn to protect them. Officer Thompson, seated near the back of the room, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Each testimony felt like a personal indictment, challenging the narrative he had constructed to justify his actions. As the morning wore on, the atmosphere in the room grew increasingly charged. Voices were raised, accusations flew, and more than once David had to call for order. But through it all, a sense of catharsis began to emerge. Long-held grievances were finally being aired, painful truths acknowledged. Just before the lunch recess, Sarah took the stand. She had agonized over whether to participate, worried about compromising her objectivity as a documentarian. But in the end, she knew her footage could be crucial in establishing the facts of the case. "I'll let the video speak for itself," Sarah said, her voice steady as she queued up the footage on the large screen at the front of the room. The audience watched in stunned silence as the events of that day unfolded before them. The raw footage, unedited and unfiltered, left no room for interpretation. Officer Thompson's aggressive approach, Maya's confusion and fear, the escalation that led to her arrest, it was all there in high definition. As the video ended, a hush fell over the room. David looked over at the police commissioner, whose face had grown pale. "I think," David said, breaking the silence, "we need to have a serious discussion about police training and accountability." The afternoon session was dominated by testimony from law enforcement officials and policy experts. They spoke of outdated training methods, implicit bias, and the need for community-oriented policing. Through it all, David listened intently, taking notes and asking pointed questions. As the hearing neared its conclusion, David called for Officer Thompson to take the stand. A murmur ran through the crowd as Hank made his way to the front of the room. He stood before the panel, his usual confidence notably absent. Officer Thompson, David began, his tone measured but firm. Having heard all the testimony today and seen the video evidence, do you stand by your actions on the day in question? Hank hesitated, feeling the weight of every eye in the room upon him. In that moment, he saw two paths stretching out before him, one of denial and defensiveness, the other of accountability and potential redemption. Taking a deep breath, Hank made his choice. "No, sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I made a mistake. My actions were not in line with my duty to protect and serve. I let my biases cloud my judgment, and Mrs. Johnson paid the price for that." A collective gasp went up from the audience. Maya, who had been stoic throughout the proceedings, felt tears welling up in her eyes. It wasn't vindication she felt, but a glimmer of hope that perhaps real change was possible. David nodded solemnly. "Thank you for your honesty, Officer Thompson. It's a first step, but an important one." As the hearing came to a close, David addressed the room one final time. "What we've heard today is difficult, but necessary. It's clear that we need sweeping reforms in our law enforcement practices, in our community relations, and in our own hearts and minds. This won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. But today, we've taken the first crucial steps towards." As the hearing came to a close, David addressed the room one final time. "What we've heard today is difficult, but necessary. It's clear that we need sweeping reforms in our law enforcement practices, in our community relations, and in our own hearts and minds. This won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. But today, we've taken the first crucial steps towards building a more just and equitable society for all our citizens." The crowd began to disperse, the air thick with a mixture of emotions: hope, anger, determination, and uncertainty. As people filed out of the auditorium, conversations sparked in every corner, with individuals from different backgrounds finding common ground in their desire for change. Maya, still processing the day's events, found herself approached by a group of young activists. Their eyes shone with admiration and purpose. "Mrs. Johnson," one of them said, "your courage has inspired us. We want to know how we can help keep this momentum going." A small smile played on Maya's lips as she regarded the eager faces before her. "Education is key," she replied. "We need to make sure everyone understands their rights and responsibilities. Let's organize workshops, create informational materials. The more people know, the more empowered they'll be to stand up for justice." Across the room, Officer Thompson stood alone, his posture deflated. His admission had left him feeling exposed and vulnerable. As he turned to leave, he found his path blocked by Sarah, the filmmaker. "Officer Thompson," Sarah began, her tone cautious but not unkind. "I was wondering if you'd be willing to share your perspective for my documentary. I think it's important to show all sides of this story, including the challenges faced by law enforcement." Hank hesitated, surprised by the offer. After a moment's consideration, he nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think that might be good. Maybe by sharing my experience, I can help prevent others from making the same mistakes." As the day drew to a close, David found himself back in his office, surrounded by his advisors. The energy in the room was electric, a sense of purpose pervading every conversation. "Governor," his chief of staff began, "the hearing was a bold move. It's generated a lot of buzz, both positive and negative. We need to capitalize on this momentum." David nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. "I want a task force assembled immediately," he declared. "Bring together law enforcement leaders, community activists, legal experts. We need all perspectives at the table. Our goal is to draft comprehensive reform legislation within the month." As night fell over the city, the ripples from the day's events continued to spread. In homes and community centers, in police precincts and government offices, People grappled with the revelations and challenges presented at the hearing. Maya, exhausted but energized, sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by notes and ideas. She was drafting plans for a community education program, determined to empower her neighbors with knowledge of their rights and the tools to advocate for change. Sarah, back in her makeshift editing suite, pored over the footage from the hearing. She knew that her documentary now had the potential to be more than just a record of events. It could be a catalyst for national conversation and change. Hank, alone in his apartment, stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. His admission at the hearing had shaken him to his core, forcing him to confront long-held beliefs and biases. As he contemplated his future on the force, he realized that his journey of self-reflection and change was only beginning. And David, standing at the window of his office, looked out over the city he had sworn to serve. The challenges ahead were daunting, the path to real change fraught with obstacles. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of true purpose. This was why he had entered public service, not for power or prestige, but to make a meaningful difference in people's lives. As the city slept, the seeds of change planted that day began to take root. The road ahead would be long and difficult, filled with setbacks and resistance. But a spark had been lit, a spark of hope, of determination, of the belief that, together, they could build a more just and equitable society for all. The story of Maya Johnson, once a simple traffic stop gone wrong, had become a turning point in the city's history. It was a reminder that every individual had the power to effect change, that every voice raised in the pursuit of justice could echo far beyond its origin. As a new day dawned, the city stood on the brink of transformation. The work was just beginning, but the promise of a better future beckoned, urging them forward into the unknown. The following week saw the city transformed into a crucible of change. The energy that had been ignited at the public hearing spread like wildfire, touching every corner of the community. Maya, once a quiet teacher, found herself at the forefront of a movement that was growing larger by the day. Early one morning, Maya stood before a sea of faces in the city's Central Park. The crowd stretched as far as the eye could see, a diverse tapestry of citizens united in their call for justice and reform. Maya's voice, amplified by speakers, rang out clear and strong. "We are not here to tear down," she declared, her words met with cheers of approval. "We are here to build a community where every person, regardless of their race or background, can feel safe and respected. This is not just about changing laws, it's about changing hearts and minds." As Maya spoke, David watched from the sidelines, a mixture of pride and determination etched on his face. He had spent the past weeks in a whirlwind of activity, pushing for reforms with an urgency that had caught many in the political establishment off guard. The task force he had assembled was making rapid progress, drafting legislation that would overhaul police training, increase accountability, and strengthen community oversight. But David knew that laws alone were not enough. Real change would require a shift in culture, both within law enforcement and in the community at large. Across town, in a small community center, Officer Hank Thompson sat in a circle with a group of fellow officers and community members. The conversation was tense, emotions running high as both sides shared their experiences and perspectives. "I never thought about how my actions might be perceived," Hank admitted, his voice low but steady. "I always believed I was just doing my job, keeping people safe. But now I see that my biases, my assumptions, they were causing harm, even when I didn't intend them to." A young activist leaned forward, her eyes locked on Hank's. "Thank you for your honesty," she said. "It's not easy to admit to mistakes, especially in a position of authority. But this is how we start to bridge the gap, by listening to each other, by being willing to change." These dialogue sessions, organized as part of the Reform Initiative, were happening all across the city. They were difficult, often uncomfortable, But slowly, bridges were being built, and understanding was growing. Meanwhile, Sarah's documentary was taking shape, evolving into a powerful narrative that captured the city's journey. Her footage, from the initial incident to the ongoing reforms, told a story of conflict, reflection, and the possibility of redemption. One afternoon, as Sarah was editing a particularly poignant scene, she received an unexpected call. It was from a major film festival. They wanted to premiere her documentary as part of their social justice series. Sarah's heart raced as she realized the potential impact her work could have on a national stage. Back at the governor's mansion, David faced his own challenges. Pressure was mounting from various quarters. Police unions pushing back against reforms, conservative donors threatening to withdraw support, and impatient activists demanding faster action. Late one night, as David pored over the latest draft of the reform bill, Maya entered his study. She could see the toll the past weeks had taken on him, the weight of responsibility evident in the lines on his face. "You know," Maya said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder, "when I was arrested that day, I never imagined it would lead to all this. But now, seeing how people have come together, how they're fighting for change, it gives me hope." David looked up at his wife, drawing strength from her presence. "We can't let them down," he said, determination creeping back into his voice. "This might be our only chance to make real, lasting change." As the days turned into weeks, the city continued to evolve. Community policing initiatives were launched, with officers and residents working side by side to address local issues. Training programs were overhauled, with a new emphasis on de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity. The reforms weren't without their challenges. There were setbacks and moments of tension as old habits and ingrained prejudices proved difficult to overcome. But slowly, steadily, progress was being made. One crisp autumn morning, almost 3 months after the incident that had started it all, David stood on the steps of City Hall. Before him, a crowd had gathered: citizens, activists, police officers, and media from across the nation. In his hands, he held the newly signed Police Accountability and Community Empowerment Act. As David prepared to address the crowd, he caught sight of Maya in the front row, flanked by Jamal and other community leaders. He saw Sarah, her camera capturing this historic moment. And there, at the back of the crowd, stood Officer Thompson, his presence a testament to the complex journey they had all undertaken. David took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. The words he was about to speak would set the course for their city's future, and perhaps serve as a model for communities across the nation. As he stepped up to the microphone, the crowd fell silent, waiting to hear what this new chapter would bring. The city held its breath, poised on the brink of a new era. The work was far from over, but in that moment, anything seemed possible. The spark of change that had been ignited by one woman's ordeal had grown into a blazing beacon of hope, lighting the way towards a more just and equitable future for all. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation as David stepped up to the podium. The crowd before him represented every facet of the city, from longtime activists to skeptical police officers, from hopeful citizens to wary politicians. The journey to this moment had been arduous, filled with heated debates, tough compromises, and moments of both breakthrough and setback. David's voice, strong and resolute, carried across the gathered masses. "Today," he began, "we take a significant step towards building a more just and equitable society for all our citizens. The Police Accountability and Community Empowerment Act is not just a piece of legislation, it's a promise that we will do better, that we will be better." As David outlined the key points of the act: enhanced training programs, a civilian oversight board, stricter accountability measures, and increased funding for community-based initiatives. The crowd listened intently. For some, these words represented the culmination of years of struggle. For others, they heralded an uncertain future. But let me be clear, David continued, his tone growing more impassioned. This act is not about punishing our law enforcement officers. It's about empowering them to serve our community more effectively and compassionately. It's about rebuilding trust between the police and the people they are sworn to protect. In the front row, Maya felt a surge of emotion. The past months had been a whirlwind of activism, negotiation, and relentless effort. Seeing the fruits of their labor finally coming to fruition was overwhelming. She squeezed Jamal's hand, drawing strength from the solidarity of those around her. As David's speech neared its conclusion, he paused, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "The road ahead will not be easy," he admitted. "Change never is. But I believe in the people of this city. I believe in our capacity for growth, for compassion, for justice. Together, we can build a community where everyone feels safe, respected, and heard." The applause that followed was thunderous, a cathartic release of months of tension and hope. As David stepped back from the podium, the crowd erupted into chants and cheers. It was a moment of victory, yes, but also one of new beginnings. In the aftermath of the speech, the city buzzed with activity. News crews clamored for interviews, activists huddled to discuss next steps, and citizens engaged in passionate debates about the implications of the new act. Amidst the chaos, Officer Hank Thompson found himself face to face with Maya. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. "Mrs. Johnson," Hank began, his voice thick with emotion, "I know it doesn't change what happened, but I want you to know, I'm committed to doing better, to being better." Maya nodded, her expression a complex mixture of emotions. "It's a start, Officer Thompson," she replied. "We all have work to do." As the day wore on, the initial euphoria began to give way to the realization of the challenges that lay ahead. Implementing the act would require sustained effort, cooperation, and a willingness to confront deeply ingrained attitudes and practices. David, exhausted but exhilarated, found a quiet moment amidst the ongoing celebrations. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through the flood of messages. Congratulations from supporters, veiled threats from opponents, and everything in between. One message, however, caught his eye. It was from a national civil rights organization, expressing interest in using their city's reforms as a model for nationwide change. Meanwhile, Sarah stood at the edge of the crowd, her camera capturing the ebb and flow of emotions. Her documentary, which had started as a record of one incident, had evolved into a chronicle of a city's transformation. As she filmed, she realized that her work was far from over. The story of this community's journey was still unfolding, and she was determined to see it through. As night fell, the city settled into an uneasy quiet. The excitement of the day gave way to contemplation of the road ahead. In homes and offices, in police precincts and community centers, people grappled with what these changes would mean for their daily lives. For Maya and David, returning home after the long and emotionally charged day, there was a moment of quiet reflection. They had achieved something significant, yes, but they were acutely aware that this was just the beginning. The real work, the day-to-day effort of changing hearts and minds, of implementing reforms, of building a truly just society, was still to come. As they prepared for bed, Maya paused by the window, looking out at the city lights. "Do you think we'll really be able to make a difference?" she asked, voicing the doubt that had been nagging at her. David joined her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "I have to believe we will," he replied. "It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. But what we've started here, it's bigger than just our city now. We've shown that change is possible. That's something no one can take away." As they stood there, looking out at the city they had pledged to transform, both Maya and David knew that their journey was far from over. The act was signed, the promises made, but the real test would come in the days, months, and years ahead. It would require vigilance, perseverance, and an unwavering commitment to justice. But for now, in this quiet moment, they allowed themselves to feel a glimmer of hope. They had taken the first crucial steps towards building a better future. And though the path ahead was uncertain, they were ready to face whatever challenges lay in store, knowing that they had ignited a spark of change that had the potential to light the way for communities far beyond their own. As the weeks turned into months, the city found itself navigating uncharted waters. The implementation of the Police Accountability and Community Empowerment Act brought with it a wave of changes, some welcome and others met with resistance. The journey that had begun with Maya's arrest had evolved into a complex tapestry of reform, reflection, and at times conflict. One crisp autumn morning, Maya stood before her class, her students hanging on her every word. She had always been passionate about teaching, but now her lessons carried a new weight, a lived experience that brought history and civics to life in ways textbooks never could. Remember, she told her students, her voice firm but kind, change doesn't happen in a vacuum. It requires courage, persistence, and the willingness to listen and learn from one another. As Maya spoke, she couldn't help but reflect on the unexpected turns her life had taken. From a teacher to an activist, from a victim to a symbol of resilience, each role had shaped her, challenging her to grow in ways she never anticipated. Across town, in the heart of the police department, a different kind of education was taking place. Officer Hank Thompson, once the face of the department's failings, had become an unlikely advocate for change. Today, he stood before a group of new recruits, his expression serious as he shared his story. "I thought I knew what it meant to protect and serve," Hank began, his voice carrying a hint of regret. "But I had to learn the hard way that our job is about more than just enforcing laws. It's about building trust, about seeing the humanity in every person we interact with." The recruits listened intently, some with skepticism, others with growing understanding. Hank's journey from disgraced officer to reform advocate had not been easy, but his willingness to confront his mistakes had earned him a unique platform to influence the next generation of law enforcement. Meanwhile, in the governor's office, David found himself embroiled in a new battle. The initial wave of support for the reforms had given way to a complex political landscape. Some praised the changes, pointing to early signs of improved community relations. Others, particularly those with vested interests in the old system, pushed back hard. As David pored over the latest reports, a knock at his door interrupted his concentration. It was his chief of staff, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Governor," the chief of staff began, his voice tense, "we've got a situation. There's been a leak from inside the police department. Some troubling information has come to light." David's brow furrowed as he listened to the details. The leak revealed a long-standing pattern of cover-ups and misconduct within the department, going far beyond Hank Thompson's isolated incident. It implicated high-ranking officials and suggested a systemic problem that ran deeper than anyone had imagined. As the news broke, the city erupted into chaos. Protesters took to the streets, their earlier optimism giving way to renewed anger and frustration. The fragile trust that had been building between the community and law enforcement seemed on the verge of shattering. Sarah, who had been putting the finishing touches on her documentary, found herself thrust back into the heart of the story. Her phone buzzed constantly with updates and requests for interviews. She knew that how she chose to present this new information could have far-reaching consequences. In the midst of the turmoil, Maya received an unexpected call. It was from a national civil rights organization, inviting her to speak at a conference on police reform. As she considered the offer, Maya realized that their city's struggles and successes could serve as a valuable lesson for others across the country. That evening, as the city simmered with tension, David called an emergency meeting. Gathered in his office were Maya, Hank, Sarah, and key figures from both the police department and community organizations. "We're at a crossroads," David began, his voice grave. "This leak could undo everything we've worked for, or it could be the catalyst for even more significant change. The question is, how do we move forward?" The room erupted into a heated discussion. Some argued for a complete overhaul of the police department. Others cautioned against hasty actions that could further destabilize the community. Hank, visibly shaken by the revelations, spoke up. "We can't hide from this," he said, his voice firm, despite his obvious discomfort. "If we want real change, we need to confront our past honestly. No more cover-ups, no more excuses." As the night wore on, a plan began to take shape. They would launch a full, independent investigation into the police department, with complete transparency to the public. Additionally, they would expand their reform efforts, creating a citizen-led task force with real power to oversee and implement changes. In the days that followed, the city once again found itself in the national spotlight. But this time, the narrative was different. Instead of a story of corruption and cover-ups, it became a tale of a community confronting its demons head-on, of leaders willing to take bold steps in the pursuit of justice. Maya's speech at the national conference became a rallying cry for reform advocates across the country. She spoke not just of the challenges they had faced, but of the ongoing work of building a more just society. "Our journey is far from over," Maya told the rapt audience. "We've made mistakes, we've faced setbacks, but we've also shown what's possible when a community comes together to demand change. This is not just about our city. It's about setting a new standard for justice and accountability across the nation." As Maya's words echoed across the country, back in their city, the work continued. The independent investigation uncovered uncomfortable truths, leading to resignations and criminal charges for some officials. But it also revealed stories of officers who had tried to speak up, who had fought against the corrupt system from within. Sarah's documentary, now updated to include these latest developments, premiered to critical acclaim. It painted a nuanced picture of a city grappling with its past and striving for a better future. The film became a tool for education and discussion, screened in community centers, police academies, and university classrooms across the country. Hank, true to his word, continued to be a voice for change within the department. His journey from offender to advocate was not an easy one, but his persistence began to win over even his harshest critics. And David, navigating the political minefield with determination, found that his unwavering commitment to reform had earned him respect from unexpected quarters. Other governors and mayors began reaching out, seeking advice on implementing similar changes in their own jurisdictions. As the first anniversary of Maya's arrest approached, the city held a town hall meeting. The atmosphere was different from the tense gatherings of the past. There was still anger, still frustration, but also a sense of cautious hope. Maya, David, Hank, and Sarah sat together on the stage, a visual representation of how far they had come. As they fielded questions from the community, it was clear that while much had been accomplished, there was still a long road ahead. "We've made progress," Maya said in response to one particularly pointed question. "But we can't become complacent. True change requires constant vigilance and a willingness to keep pushing forward, even when it's difficult." As the meeting drew to a close, David stood to make a final statement. "A year ago, we were a city divided, trapped in cycles of mistrust and injustice. Today, we stand as a community united in our commitment to do better. We've shown that change is possible, that justice can prevail. But our work is not done. It may never be done. And that's okay, because the struggle for a more just society is not a destination. It's a journey. And it's a journey we'll continue to take together." The applause that followed was not the thunderous cheering of a battle won, but the steady, determined clapping of a community ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As Maya looked out at the faces in the crowd, hopeful, skeptical, determined, she knew that their story was far from over. But she also knew that they had created something powerful, something that could inspire change far beyond the borders of their city. The spark that had been ignited by her arrest had grown into a beacon of hope, lighting the way toward a future where justice, equality, and mutual respect were not just ideals, but realities lived out in the day-to-day interactions between citizens and those sworn to protect them. It was a future worth fighting for, and they were just getting started.